The Center for Critical Thinking and Moral Critique, in concert with Sonoma State University, is proud to present videotape proceedings of the International Conference on Critical Thinking and Educational Reform.
Okay, so this is part of a series, and let me tell you where we are in the series. The series is called How to Teach Critical Thinking. And the first of the series was entitled How to Teach Students to Seek the Logic of Things. The second was How to Teach Students to Listen and Read Well. The third was How to Teach Students to Write Well. And the fourth and fifth were two-part sequence, how to teach students to assess their own work. The first part of that dealt with the foundations of doing that. The second part dealt with the tactics of doing that. And this is concerned to determine how it is and why it is that both students and teachers often don't reason well. And so, in a way, it's dealing with the impediment to the process. And let me say that I think that right from the outset that it's a bigger impediment if teachers don't reason well than if students don't reason well, because as teachers we have significant control over the environment under which students are learning, but they have no control over who's teaching them. And therefore, if there are problems in the reasoning of the teacher, then there are very significant problems. And in fact, there are significant problems in the reasoning of lots of teachers, not due to any fault on the part of those teachers, but due to the fault of the education which they had. Because you can go through the university and do very little reasoning. Many classes are focused on cramming, or you can get by with cramming, and they use multiple choice testing, and you can get through with a very minimum of reasoning. And as a result, many teachers survive the system in the same way that students are surviving the system that the teachers are now inflicting on them, by rote memorization, coverage of content without comprehension, very little writing, undisciplined reading, passive listening, very little speaking, that speaking not involving much reasoning. And so the system reduplicates itself, and we have a problem. So what I want to look at with you is to help you to see what is it to reason well, and what sorts of evidence do we have that teachers are not reasoning well, and students as well. Here's one bit of evidence that I see as I work with teachers. When I ask them to design assignments that involve reasoning, and then I look at those assignments, I see how frequently they either don't know how to construct the assignment, or the assignment they construct does not in fact call for reasoning. Very often, it sounds at first blush to be calling for reasoning, but then you see if you repeat what the textbook said, you'd actually you would get the answer that was expected. And so, first of all, let's briefly look at what reasoning is, just to make sure that we're starting with a common denominator here. So, this triad, which you see before you and which I've started most of these sessions with, deals with the triad that defines the logic of teaching. It also defines the logic of learning in the following way. To some extent, in all learning, there is the logic of the content. In every situation, whatever there is to be learned, that thing to be learned has a logic. If it didn't have a logic, you couldn't learn it. What does that mean? That means that whatever you're trying to learn, there is some system of meanings or ideas in logical connection to each other which make sense of the thing. For example, if you want to understand the logic of our bone structure, then what you have to understand is a system of meanings, all of which fit together in a perfectly logical system with everything having its place and perfectly intelligible in relationship to each other. Here's another example of how logical reality is. You can give an anthropologist one bone from one creature, and very often the anthropologist can deduce the whole culture by first deducing the other bones, then deducing what goes on the bones, then deducing the environment which that person lived in, and the culture, the level of development, and so forth. It's because all of that is in logical relationship to each other. I sometimes give this example. If you understand what a wooden table is, then you understand that if there's a wooden table, there must be trees. And if you understand what a tree is, then you understand that if there is a tree, there must be sunlight. And if you understand what sunlight is, then you must see that there must be some stars. And if there are stars, then you must see that there is a solar system. So that if you understand the logical implications of a wooden table, you understand there's at least one solar system. That is, all of knowledge is logically interconnected. And that if you understand one bit of knowledge fully, you can deduce much more knowledge, and from that deduce other knowledge, and so forth and so on. We couldn't do this if reality itself wasn't logical. If reality, and I don't want to be metaphysical here, but I want to make a point, if reality was absurd, that is, it couldn't be understood, it didn't make sense, it just kept changing its nature from moment to moment. One day water boiled at 100 degrees, and the next day it boiled at 5 degrees, and sometimes it turned into a zebra, and sometimes, then there would be no knowledge, because reality was so plastic that it had no nature. Well, reality isn't like that. It changes, but not arbitrarily. And when there is a change, we assume there's a logic to the change. There's a way to make sense of it. There's a system of meanings that makes sense to it. Okay, so reasoning is figuring out that logic. It's figuring out whodunit in a mystery program. It's figuring out what the answer is if this is what you're given in the way of information. Or it's figuring out you can't answer the question with this information. Every question that you can ask has a logic, that is, imposes constraints on the answerer. So if you ask a question that is, quote, an empirical question, then to do justice to the question, you have to gather facts. The question imposes upon you by its very logic. It is of the nature of that question that you must conform to it by getting information and data, and if you don't, you're not responding to the question. And if I ask you a question of fact and you give me an opinion, you're not responding to the logic of the question. The question doesn't call for opinion, it calls for fact, and that requires a special process. So we form questions, we define questions, we choose questions, that's our choice. But once we frame a question, the question imposes upon us constraints. Therefore, knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge requires discipline and logic, because reality itself is ordered and sensible and logical. The problem is, what is the logic of it? What is the logic of your relationship to your mate? What is the logic of your parenting? What is the logic of the political system today, and is that the logic of democracy? Or is it some other logic? Is it media logic? Is schooling the logic of training, the logic of socialization, the logic of indoctrination, or the logic of education? What is the logic of language? Language itself has a logic to it. So when you use a term, you are not free to use it in any way you want, because the term has an established logic. The word selfish does not have the same logic as the word self in self-esteem. And self-confidence, as a word, does not imply what arrogance implies. So you could be arrogant and not self-confident. You could be self-confident and not arrogant. And if you call a self-confident person arrogant, you're inaccurate, or you misunderstand the logic of arrogance. In any case, language imposes upon us constraints, reality imposes upon us constraints, and reasoning is the process whereby we try to operate within those constraints in order to make sense of things. And so therefore discipline is an essential part of it. Well, most teachers have not been introduced to this discipline. Many teachers believe, for example, that everyone has their own meanings for words, not realizing that if this were true, that language and communication would be unintelligible. If every word has a different meaning depending on the speaker, then dictionaries would be impossible, because each word would have to be followed by Mr. Schultz, 1025 North Sacramento Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. Next meaning. Mrs. Brown, Sepulveda Boulevard, Los Angeles. And we'd list 200 million meanings of each word in the dictionary. And of course, the explanations themselves would be in words which would have to be referenced to people and so forth. And you see the absurdity of it. But somehow people are going through the system and not noticing that these beliefs don't make sense. That we have beliefs about language that make language absurd, and that we, in fact, don't even grasp the logic of knowledge. And sometimes it's surprising to people who don't grasp the logic of knowledge. For example, the amount of people who think that knowledge can be given will give students knowledge and then they will comprehend it. This is unintelligible. You can't give somebody knowledge. You can give them a sentence and test whether they recall it. But recalling a sentence is not having knowledge. Otherwise, playing back a tape recording would be playing back the knowledge that the tape recorder has. But a tape recorder has no knowledge because it doesn't comprehend what it records, and comprehension is presupposed in knowledge. Therefore, to say, I know it, but I don't comprehend it, is a contradiction. But nevertheless, we talk that way, as if you could give knowledge, and then, of course, this encourages didactic teaching, which is not based upon reasoning, and so forth and so on. So there are many, many reasons why teachers, as well as students, may not know what knowledge is, may not know what reasoning is, and therefore cannot help students to learn how to reason. And there is no simple way to convey these ideas to teachers, because teachers have to learn them in the same way that students have to learn them, slowly, through the logic of their own thinking. And that's why, of course, staff development in critical thinking is not something that happens overnight. And someone who says, we've allocated a full day for critical thinking, come in, teach the teachers how to think critically and teach for critical thinking so that they can do it the next day in their classroom. This person does not understand the logic of critical thinking, does not understand the logic of learning, and does not understand the logic of quality staff development. Now, if the person said, we would like to get started with a day, and we're going to follow it up in these ways. And this is our long-term planning in order to achieve this. As we cultivate the reasoned development of our teachers over the long haul, then they would understand that logic, because it is the nature of learning that it must proceed in this way. We have no choice. Okay, well, let's look at specific cases here. Let me give you the example first to start of the student essay which the California Assessment Program staff chose as a, to quote it, exceptional achievement in reasoned writing, which contains very little reasoning, and what it contains is bad reasoning. Now, let's look closely at this student essay and see what it is that is here and what teachers would need to see about this, how they would need to understand it in order to recognize that this is not an exceptional achievement in reasoned writing, but it is instead something else. First of all, let's look at the instructions, or at least a summary of the instructions, and then we'll give ourselves some criteria so that as we look at this, students were asked to write an evaluative essay. Now let's start with that word, evaluative. This is connected with the logic of evaluation and what is involved in the logic of evaluation. What does the logic of evaluation contrast with? Well, for one thing, it contrasts with the logic of preference. Because, for example, I can prefer something to something else without actually evaluating it. I could be incompetent to evaluate it, yet I could still prefer X to Y. And therefore, let's say, as somebody completely untutored in the culinary arts, I may prefer a McDonald's hamburger to a dinner designed a la Escoffier. And anyone who understood the principles of fine cooking would realize that I was not competent to evaluate a chef. But nevertheless, I prefer the McDonald's hamburger. Preference and evaluation have a different logic. You prefer what you prefer because you prefer it. This is a matter of subjective taste, and everyone has a right to their own taste. Evaluation can only be done for a purpose. It presupposes something to be evaluated and criteria of evaluation in keeping with the purpose. And so if you're evaluating, you have a purpose, you have an object of evaluation, you must gather facts about the thing to be evaluated. The criteria must be relevant to the purpose. The criteria must be applied fairly to the information which you have gathered fairly, and your conclusion must follow accurately from those facts based on those criteria. In other words, there's a logic to evaluation. There are certain areas where you can make a mistake in evaluation, but you can't make a mistake in preference. Preference is not the thing you make a mistake about. And so if you say, look, I prefer a McDonald's hamburger, I can't say, but couldn't you be mistaken? Well, you can't mistake what you prefer. You know what you prefer, unless you haven't tasted something else, and I'd say try it, you'll like it. And maybe you will, and maybe you won't. Okay, we immediately see after a little reading that this very fundamental and important distinction is confused by the State Department of Education. Students were asked to write an evaluative essay, make judgments about the worth of a book, television program, or type of music. Okay, we want an evaluation. And then support their judgments. Okay, a judgment isn't a preference, with reasons and evidence. Students must consider possible criteria. Okay, let's start looking. We want an evaluation. We want to see their judgment. That is, we want to look at their conclusions. they're supposed to present reasons and evidence. So we're going to look for reasons. We're going to look at evidence. And since you conduct the evaluation differently, if there are different criteria, we want alternative criteria. And we want a justification of those, that's implied with, must consider possible criteria. Criteria is plural, that means more than one, on which to base an evaluation. Analyze their subject in the light of the criteria. Okay, so we want the subject analyzed in the light of the criteria. Criterion 1, criterion 2. All right. Now, and select evidence that clearly supports their judgment. So it's not enough to give evidence. The evidence must support the judgment. Each student was assigned one of the following evaluative tasks: to write a letter to a favorite author telling why they especially liked one of the author's books. Okay, now that sounds an awful lot like a preference. I liked it because it was interesting and it had a lot of action. That's not much of an evaluation. Sounds a bit like a preference. To explain why they enjoyed one television program more than any other. Why do you like Terminator 2 better than you like Rocky 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Because it has more action in it. That may be all the reason you have. If so, it's perfectly fine for a preference. The task, or third, to justify their preference for a type of music. To justify their preference. There's a confusion here. They may not have a justification for their preference. They may need no justification for their preference. But this is not recognized. The task made clear that students must argue convincingly for their preference and not just offer unsupported opinions. This is a sample essay from a student who demonstrated exceptional achievement. Okay, so we can see that the instructions are a bit confused. They're not clear about whether they want a preference, which in fact doesn't require reasoned judgment, or whether they want reasoned judgment, which isn't a matter of preference. And so if this is well cooked, it's well cooked, whether you prefer it or not. If this is well designed as a screwdriver, then it's a well-designed screwdriver, even if you don't personally like to use it. Okay, so here's the essay. Rock around the clock. Well, you're getting to the age when you have to learn to be responsible, my mother yelled out. Yes, but I can't be available all the time to do my appointed chores. I'm only 13. I want to be with my friends, to have fun. I don't think it's fair for me to babysit while you run your little errands, I snapped back. I sprinted upstairs to my room before my mother could start another sentence. Okay, let's stop there. So far, we don't have any reasoning. We have an emotional exchange between an adolescent and his or her mother. And we have evidence, if anything, of a child who is impolite and who does not display empathy toward his mother. We don't have any preference here at all. And we don't know exactly what this would be evidence of, but let's read on. Maybe somehow or another we'll find it to be evidence of something. Okay, I turned on my radio and Shout was playing. I noted how true the song was, and I threw some punches at my pillow. Okay, he turns on this music, Shout, and it stimulates him to throw punches at a pillow. What is that evidencing? That songs of a certain kind bring out a certain very strong reaction. That the person is influenced in their action by the music that is played, especially certain kind of music, so you can get violent behavior from this person by playing songs that simulate violence. This is what it appears to be showing. And the next statement seems further evidence of that. The song ended and Control by Janet Jackson came on. I stopped beating my pillow. I suddenly felt at peace with myself. The song had slowed me down. Okay, now again, it seems to be evidence that if you want this person to start punching their pillow, put on Shout. If you want them to slow down, play Control. Evidence of songs controlling the individual. And if this was true of all of us, then somebody in control could play a certain song, we'd all respond in one way, or if they wanted to move our behavior over here, they'd play another song, and that would make us respond in another way. I pondered briefly over all the songs that helped me to control my feelings. Now, if that's the conclusion, the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. It supports the opposite conclusion. He should have said, I pondered over all the songs that control me and my reactions. That would be the conclusion which fit the evidence, and therefore that's not very good reasoning if we're interpreting correctly. The list was endless. You've only given us one example. We don't know whether your other examples would prove your point. He's saying he has evidence, but he's not giving us the evidence. And so we don't know whether that conclusion is justified, even if the first one was. It's simply assertion. So is my devotion to rock music and pop rock. Okay, now that's a pretty strong statement, but rather on the vague side, that he's devoted to pop rock. But we have only one example, and if we're going to follow the reasoning, he's devoted because it controls him. He misinterprets it as thinking that he is somehow freed on the part of this music. These songs help me to express my feelings, they make me wind down, and above all, they make me feel good. Without this music, I might have turned out to be a violent and grumpy person. Again, a conclusion without foundation. If it has a foundation, we don't know what the foundation is. The student does not understand what it would be. Suppose he took that. Is it true that without violent and grumpy, without rock music, he would have been a violent and grumpy program? That raises the issue, under what conditions do people become violent or grumpy? Now that question requires evidence about human nature, about experience. If the child really wanted to reason about that, and I could imagine raising that kind of a question in class. It's a complex question, it would require a lot of reflection. This person is not reflecting very deeply on it. Now we get two final paragraphs. Some of my favorite songs are by Howard Jones, Pet Shop Boys, and Madonna. Totally irrelevant. Who cares what your favorite songs are? That does not bear on the reasoning. I especially like songs that have a message in it, such as Stand By Me by Ben King. Now a little bit of reasoning. This song tells me to stand by the people I love and not to question them in times of need. Basically, this song is telling me to believe in my friends because they are my friends. That's not very good reasoning. So if a song tells you to hate your friends, then you'd hate your friends because you like the song. You do everything the songs tell you to do. How do you know? Don't you ever decide for yourself whether you're going to accept the message in a song or not? Well, we're not given the benefit of any reflection on this. Doesn't sound like a very reflective response. My favorite type of music is pop rock and rock. Without them, there is no way I could survive mentally. Conclusion does not follow in the least. No evidence presented to support it. They are with me in times of trouble, and best of all, they're only a step away. Again, no reasoning to bad reasoning. On a scale of 0 to 8, which was the scale here, this should have been given a 1 or a 2, and it was clearly given an 8. State Department of Education, the largest assessment team in the nation, second only to the U.S. Department of Education. They had a state full of children to take the example. Surely there was good reasoning out there somewhere. They took terrible reasoning and they chose it to disseminate it to the nation. 150,000 copies. Now, here's an example of reasoning which we concocted in response and tried to make it something that you could imagine a child reasoning, and it's good reasoning, and we've given it to teachers, and almost inevitably, on the whole, the teachers grade the weak reasoning higher than the good reasoning. Now, this is true. About 30% of the teachers grade the strong reasoning high and the weak reasoning low. But about 70% of them grade the weak reasoning high and the strong reasoning low. So, we've got about 30% of the teachers who can evaluate reasoning, but that still leaves 70% who are doing it opposite. Here's the reasoning, and see if you can see why this is good reasoning. Can I prove rock music is better? Is the title. It's certainly hard to objectively judge music based on justifiable criteria because most people don't have any real standards for the music they listen to other than they like it. My friends and I are probably no different from other people. We listen to music because we like it. But this assignment asks me to give good reasons why we like what we like. I'm not sure I can, but I'll try. I first wonder, what would be a really good reason for liking any kind of music, other than it sounds good to you? Well, I suppose that one possible good reason for preferring one kind of music to another is that it expresses better the problems we face and what we can do to solve those problems. Does this give me a good reason for preferring rock music to other kinds? Perhaps so. Certainly rock music is often about problems that we have, problems of love and sex, school and parents, drugs and drink. I'm not sure, however, whether the answers in the songs actually are good answers or just the answers that appeal to us. They might even increase our prejudices about parents, teachers, school, and love. I'm not sure. Another possible good reason for preferring one kind of music to another is that it is written better or more skillfully performed. Can I truthfully say that rock music is more skillfully written or performed than other kinds of music? In all honesty, I cannot. So what is my conclusion? It is this: I am unable to give any objective reasons for liking rock music. My friends and I are like most people. We like the music we like because we like it. For better or worse, that's all the reason we have. What do you think? Can 15 million teenagers be wrong? Okay. Now, this responds to all the elements in the question and is excellent reasoning. The reasoner is coming to the only conclusion that the evidence justifies, that they can't answer the question. That the question asks them for something that they don't have the evidence to respond to. And that's the conclusion that a good reasoner comes to when asked to do something that they don't have evidence and reason for. And therefore, this should be given an 8. But many teachers say it's weak reasoning because it didn't answer the question. The question asked for a justification for the preference. This didn't justify the preference, therefore it's bad reasoning. So, why is it that the teachers, as they read this, are not noticing the strong points of this reasoning? Now, what makes it strong? Number one, it analyzes the question. And it considers alternative criteria. Number two, it looks at the evidence available in the light of the question and those criteria. Number three, it makes an inference which is justified in light of the criteria and the evidence available. And number four, it explains why its conclusion is appropriate in the light of what came before it. It does just exactly what we want good reasoners to do. But it was clear that the teachers, as going through, were not saying, what is the question at issue? What does the question at issue require? What sort of evidence is relevant? Has that evidence been considered? What are the criteria? Have alternative criteria been considered? Have good reasons been given? And so forth. That is, these questions, the questions you ask about reasoning, were not the questions the teachers were asking themselves when they read it. Here, I think, were the questions that teachers were asking on the first one. Is it witty? Is it amusing? Is it articulate? Is this an intelligent student? Are they fluent? But that wasn't the assignment. That wasn't what was supposed to be happening. And so what we have to do is help teachers to see the difference between smooth, articulate, amusing fluff and solid, ordinary, good reasoning. And this means that in in-service and staff development, we have to emphasize reasoning, and then we have to have a sufficiently long-term approach so that teachers get example of strong historical reasoning, mediocre historical reasoning, poor historical reasoning, and so forth, and learn to see why one is one and the other is the other. Let's take a poem by John Donne. Suppose high school students had to read this poem, and suppose this was the question at issue here for them. What is John Donne saying in his poem, Death Be Not Proud? Okay, now, you might say, well, how is that a question of reasoning? Well, the evidence is in the poem, and what you have to do is critically read the poem so as to infer its meaning. So you have to reason out of various possible interpretations, the best possible interpretation, then you have to justify it by the evidence in the poem. Okay, here is the poem itself. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For thou, whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. Much pleasure then from thee, much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and doth with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Okay. Directions. Clearly read the poem below, trying to figure out what the poet is saying. Be careful to explain what your interpretation is and what exactly it is based upon. Show us your reasoning. Make sure your interpretation is consistent with all of what the poem says. Student 1. I don't like this poem. It is boring and confusing. The guy does not spell correctly. He talks a lot about death, but he doesn't say anything. I don't see why he thinks death is mighty or why he thinks it can kill him. He says a lot of confusing things. At one time, he says it gives pleasure and then talks about bones resting, which makes no sense. Then he talks about flowers and sleeping. Finally, he says that death shall be no more and that it shall die. I don't get it. Why doesn't he just say what he wants to say? This is a terrible poem. Why do we have to read such stupid stuff? Okay? Now, here is a student who didn't reason concerning the poem, who gave up on the poem, who doesn't like the poem, who doesn't get the whole idea, the logic of the assignment, doesn't get the logic of the content, doesn't get the logic of reasoning, is just sort of out of the ball game. Okay, this student provides us with virtually no reasoning at all. Rather than attempt to figure out what the poet is saying by closely reading what is said, the student rejects the poem, dismisses it emotionally. The result is that the student flagrantly misreads the poem and blames his misreading on the poet itself and the poem. The student needs to be introduced to the concept of critical reading, in which the reader uses the text as evidence to use in interpreting the meaning. Okay, student number 2. Mr. Donne says that death should not be proud. It is not mighty or dreadful. He says this because death is like sleep, and when you go to sleep, you rest. Therefore, because it is restful, even the best people sleep, even slaves. And sleeping is better than being poisoned or being sick. Finally, he says, we only sleep a while, and then we awake, and then death is gone. In fact, it is dead. He thinks this is good. Okay, now we've got a little bit of reasoning, but not a lot. Here's the commentary. There is more reasoning in this student's work, but most of it ignores the evidence of what the poem says. The poem does not say or imply, for example, that, quote, because it, death, is restful, even the best people sleep, even slaves. The poem does not say or imply that sleeping is better than being poisoned or being sick. Finally, it is clear that the student is not getting the major point of the poem, namely that because of the promised resurrection or last judgment and eternal life in heaven or hell, there is a sense in which death is not real or lasting, but only something that will die once the last judgment occurs. Like the first student, this student also needs to be introduced to the concept of critical reading, in which the student uses the text as evidence in interpreting meaning. Finally, student 3. It is clear that Donne believes in God, or at least in an afterlife. This is implied in the first 4 lines, which I interpret as saying something like this, quote, don't think you're so powerful because no one really dies. Don't think you're so powerful because no one really dies, but only appears to die. In parentheses, people who die are really just awaiting their resurrection. This interpretation is supported in the next line, which implies that what we call death is really an escape, or is really a kind of sleep, and is not therefore very bad. In fact, as he says, sleep often gives us pleasure. The next lines make a different kind of point, but still are criticism of the view that death is mighty and dreadful. Death, he says, is not able to control fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Furthermore, not only is it not able to control these other forces, it can't even get away with such unpleasant associates as poison, war, and sickness. Finally, he reasons, narcotics make us sleep as well as death does, and when everyone is resurrected for the final judgment, which I infer is what he means, then death itself will be gone forever and therefore will die. Okay, so then finally, this student is working his or her way through the poem, figuring out the poem as a whole, making sense of the poem, and coming to conclusions which they are justifying by means of the text. And so it's in getting example after example of this distinction, seeing what it is to reason well, seeing what it is to reason in a mediocre fashion, seeing what it is not to reason at all, and seeing it in case after case, that teachers and students will learn what reasoning is all about. And so what we need in staff development and what we need in the classroom is really one and the same. The teachers need exactly what the students need, not something different, something identical. They need to understand the logic of reasoning. They need to understand the logic of the content, say the logic of the question asked. And so if this question is asked, it imposes these requirements. If this question is asked, it imposes those requirements. They need to understand that just as the students do. And they need to understand the logic of their thinking. And including in that, they need to understand why so much of their thinking is undisciplined. You see, we live in a fundamentally irrational society in which most of the communication does not involve much reasoning. Media logic does not use reasoning, by the way, not on the whole. It uses associational reasoning, where you can get connections that are not logical, and most of the advertisements give you no argument for the product. In fact, they give you no information about the product. They set up an association. Infinity status, infinity sex, infinity success. They want to get an association going there. And so you have an advertisement for Coca-Cola, and you see young, healthy, sexually vibrant young people with their animal spirits in full swing. And what's the hidden message? If it is logic, if you drink Coca-Cola, you'll have good sex. If they put it in that way, nobody would accept that because it's absurd from the logical point of view, but they're not working with logic. They're manipulating the viewer. Movies now, there's no reason to plot there. There's nothing to figure out. It's just special effect after special effect, shock after shock. You know, each program is almost devoid of conversation, and the conversation has nothing to do with figuring anything out. It's got to be weird, eccentric, queer, odd, flashy, but it can't involve the mind at all. The closest thing you can come to it is old Sherlock Holmes mysteries or Murder, She Wrote, or some mystery program. That's about as close as you come to it. And I'm not sure those are really worked out that well as far as reasoning. I mean, I'm not a student of that. Maybe I'm wrong. But when you watch programs, let's say news programs or even discussion programs, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, the logic of the questions asked are typically ignored totally. So the news person asks the question, and the respondent says something that usually has nothing to do with the question. Sometimes the news person will say, "You didn't answer my question," but they're not concerned to answer the question. They're concerned to set up some kind of relationship between something positive and themselves, which is the media logic they're working with. And very often the questions that the news persons ask are irrelevant to the issues of the day. In any case, by and large, no one notices that because no one is expecting reasoning, and we don't get it. And when we're living in a society where reasoning is not part of public discourse, where our leaders don't reason, where the news people don't reason, where our neighbors don't reason, where the movies don't reason, where the television programs don't reason, then why should we expect teachers to reason? Just doesn't seem a reasonable expectation. But on the other hand, at the very same time that we are in this terrible circumstance as far as a low level of reasoning, low appreciation for reasoning, we're discovering that to make advances economically, we need reasoning. In Toyota Corporation, 90% of the employees last year made suggestions for improvement in their job. That requires reasoning. And most of those suggestions were accepted. Japanese workers make twice as many suggestions for improvement as American workers do, and Japanese management accept 3 times the suggestions that American management do, because there's a different logic going on in Japanese industry, and it's the logic of critical thinking. That is, they believe that you need workers to think critically about what they're doing and to reason about their job and to assess it and to figure out how to make it better, and that this is essential to success. And they also think in the long term and not in the short term. But in American business, the assumption is that workers are stupid and there's no point in asking them because they don't know and they don't care anyway. You need a process which ignores the thinking of the workers and makes the job so simple that they couldn't muck it up. It does not respect the workers. It respects management, and it pays the management far more than management deserves, as we can see by statistics and how much Japanese management is paid in relationship to workers versus American management is paid in relationship to workers. And the logic of the, quote, American way of business is not successful in comparison to either the Japanese or the Germans because of all the decisions that are connected with setting up an economic system in a reasonable way. Reinvesting in the infrastructure, reinvesting in the long term, preventing leveraged buyouts from taking place, all of which are part of the Japanese and the German and the European system, and it's very easy to see why that system will always win in contest with a system which takes the short term, allows leveraged buyouts, treats the worker as stupid, does not encourage critical thinking, encourages financial manipulation rather than investment in the future, and so forth and so on. So at one time, we live in a world in which reason, in general, culturally, is not valued, but those economies that are moving ahead, and in those contexts of the economies, they're using reasoning, they're valuing reasoning, and they're rewarding reasoning. And this is being discovered by Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, and very slowly by the business community. We sometimes idealize the business community, but I think we have to remember the evidence. For example, that the American steel industry went bottom up before it would learn from the Japanese steel industry. That the automobile industry just about went bottom up before it started to learn from the Japanese auto industry, and it still is not very competitive in relationship to it. And so I don't think we can idealize American business. What we've got to see is that there is an economic logic which is developing in the world which requires reasoning, and furthermore, reasoning is a very powerful ability to develop. This process, I think, is slowly starting to take place, but the fundamental question to me is this: will we in this country discover the power of reasoning and apply it to the context of our political life, our economic life, the way we approach the environment, our social problems, and so forth, in time? Or will we continue to go down culturally, in an economic way, in terms of the way we're socially facing our social problems, until we hit the bottom before we'll learn? Do we have to learn the hard way? Or could we learn by recognizing that other cultures who are being successful in certain domains are cultivating the kind of reasoning which is necessary? I personally am very skeptical about our learning in the short haul, because I think that culturally speaking, we tend to define ourselves as number one, and this tends to produce arrogance rather than humility. And so I don't think most Americans expect to learn from foreigners, but rather presuppose that foreigners are supposed to learn from us. Yet I think we're at a stage where we need to learn from others. I'm not sure we're ready to learn. Eventually we will learn, because that's the nature of reality. You have to face it sooner or later. The schools have traditionally followed rather than led. And here's a circumstance where I think the schools need to lead. And that involves teachers thinking about some of these global economic trends, developing their reasoning, seeing the importance of reasoning, and bringing it into the classroom so that students can be ready for this world that is coming. It's a big challenge, ladies and gentlemen, and I certainly hope we accept that challenge and respond to it, but it will require a lot of rethinking on our part, and only time will tell whether we're up to it. Thank you very much.